Hello and welcome back to the Outdoors Station for the first part of a two-part podcast, and also over on YouTube you'll be watching possibly a one-parter. I haven't quite decided yet how I will edit it, with Anna Richards, who's a freelance writer based over in Lyon, France. She completed this year most of the TCT. That's not the PCT, the AT or the CDT, but the TCT, the Transcaucasian Trail, a 1,500 kilometre, that's 900 miles for the imperial people, trail that takes in Azerbaijan, Armenia and Georgia, based over on the edge of Asia. This is a brand new trail which is currently opening up, and they are seeking adventurous hikers to undertake the trail and see what that part of the world offers. It's a fascinating conversation with Anna. She's completely open and honest about all aspects of her experience and her adventure, and it is a joy to listen to her enthusiasm about the experience that she had on the TCT. So without further ado, here's the podcast, and here's the video and my conversation with Anna Richards. Well, Anna, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this podcast. I'm very, very excited to have this conversation with you. I've done the introduction, explaining to people who you are and where you are, but please do, for everybody who's listening, explain how you became a writer and you're located in France.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your podcast as well, Bob. So I moved to France in September of last year. I was already writing part-time alongside my salary job for a travel company. There wasn't a huge market in selling trips to India during the pandemic. So that kind of gave me a platform to expand on what I was writing. And I found that I was getting more and more work travel writing. And I thought, well, perhaps I could do this full time. And then a series of sort of personal circumstances led to me just making very dramatic changes in my life. I lost my father and I had a bit of a life crisis, and I thought, I'll run away to France and be a writer and sort of run away from all of my problems. And incredibly, it's actually worked very well. So now I live in Lyon, and I'm a travel and outdoor writer full time. It was a pretty good decision.
Well, that's fantastic. And you're obviously enjoying life as a digital nomad. It's working out for you on all levels.
Yeah, I am. I mean, I think that, there's been a lot of learning curves as well, because, when you kind of plunge into the world of freelance writing, there's not a lot of sort of resources out there, bar, trying to sign up for a course that charges you ridiculous amounts of money to explain how to make a living as a freelance writer. So I've kind of figured things out for myself through kind of a series of trial and error. But yeah, it's worked very, very well. I mean, I work from a co-working space because being a digital nomad is great. I love the freedom to work from anywhere, but I don't like to be on my own, which is strange for somebody who disappears into the wild for weeks at a time on on really isolated hikes. But I don't like to work on my own. So yeah, I'm at co-working each day.
And are the French treating you well?
They are being incredibly welcoming. Yeah, I pester them. I steal lots of their ideas, and every time we're at lunch together, somebody starts a conversation about something, I think, well, that could be interesting, and all of a sudden the notebook comes out and I'm interviewing them at lunch. But no, they've been incredibly welcoming. I've been very, very lucky to make a very good group of friends here, and I think that I will be here for a very long time.
Oh, fantastic! Well, that's good to hear. Now, you have your childhood was obviously in Cornwall, and you've done a fair amount of travelling. Have you done many long distance hiking trails per se before you sort of went on to this epic event we're about to talk about?
Yes, I have, and I'm very glad that I had as well, because I think that if I'd set off on the Transcaucasian Trail as my first long distance hike, I don't think that I would have got nearly as far as I did. Pretty much my entire adult life has been working in travel or in some shape or form, and I'm also a bit of a queen of the gap year. When I studied languages at university, and I had a year abroad as part of that. And that was when I really started long distance hiking. I had a stint of 8 months in South America when I was living and working in Argentina. And Argentina is it's a hiker's playground. So I began long distance hiking whilst I was out there, finished university, and all I wanted to do was go off traveling again. So I worked in a bar just long enough to save enough money so that I could go off this time to India for a very long chunk of time. And that led to my job working for a travel company specializing in India for the next 5 years. And whenever I could afford to take a long chunk of time off, and the company were very flexible about me taking sabbaticals as well, which was an absolute blessing, I would go off on a long trip, and it would usually involve a long hike. And definitely part of my decision to move to Lyon was linked into that you've got all this spectacular mountain scenery on your doorstep as well. I mean, the Alps, the start of the Alps is an hour's drive from my house. So I can really wake up in the morning, see that the weather's nice, and, decide to go for a day stomp or even multiple days.
That's brilliant. And have you made many sort of hiking friends, or is there a separate community from sort of hiking and traveling? Because they are two slightly different communities, aren't they?
Definitely different communities, but yeah, no, really, really lovely groups. I mean, one of the ones that I did that I'm a particularly good group on was just over a year ago, hiking the GR20 across Corsica, which is a 2-week trail that crosses the vast majority of the island. And I set off completely alone. And to be honest, most days I walked alone because I like to walk alone, but I love to come together with people, at camp or when you're taking a break. But by the end of the first day, I'd already met a great bunch of people, some of whom I still see very regularly. And after the hike, we had about 9 of us cruising around in Airbnbs around Corsica that had all come together through a shared fantastic experience.
Well, I know the GR20 isn't for beginners, certainly. So you've laid out your credentials quite nicely there. So thanks very much for that. Now, this particular trek is well, it's very new, isn't it? It's coming to sort of fruition at the moment. I've been obviously doing some research prior to speaking to you, and recognise that they've been working on it for several years, but they're really getting to a point of sort of releasing it now as a long distance trek, and nicely abbreviated to TCT, which I think that's fantastic. It equates quite nicely to the PCT and the AT and the CDT. So would you like to introduce the gist of this trek, the name, where it is, and while you're doing so, I'll zoom into the map and we'll have a look at it in detail.
Sure. So yeah, the Transcaucasian Trail, or TCT, it's a long distance hiking trail that, when it's completely finished, it is going to go across Armenia, Georgia, and there's also going to be a branch in Azerbaijan, which is going to join on to the Georgian section. So the Armenia and Georgia leg, which is, I suppose, nearly complete, is about 1,500 kilometers long. Once the Azerbaijan leg with a kind of additional part in Georgia is tacked on as well, the whole thing is going to be about 3,000 kilometers, but it's not sort of one straight line. It's kind of 2 prongs that come together in Georgia. And the Armenian section, which is the section that I was tackling, is 827 kilometers in total, of which I did 580 kilometers.
Now, the website associated with it is actually extremely comprehensive, isn't it? They've done a cracking job on the website for people that are perhaps looking at this for the first time.
Yeah, it was incredibly, in some ways it's incredibly well organized. And it's funny because for the TCT, I mean, I've never ever prepared so thoroughly for a hike. I mean, usually you don't do very much preparation for a hike other than, you make sure that you've got sort of a GPX of the route downloaded, you've probably got a physical map, you plan, the meals that you're going to take for it. But with the TCT, I was doing huge amounts of preparation, and we effectively, the hikers doing it this year were kind of, I suppose, the guinea pigs for the trail. So it was people that have, hiked a lot in various corners of the world. And we had monthly training sessions via video call, where the organisers of the trail, who've been working on this trail for about 7 years, would share their tips, where we'd get to ask questions. We'd even get training sessions on different mapping applications as well. So they were incredibly thorough in trying to prepare us for the sea challenge.
Well, it's certainly an area, just below Russia and above Iran there, Iraq, an area I think that most UK, Europeans and obviously Americans would be very unfamiliar with. And if I was heading out there, I think I'd be quite apprehensive about the whole language thing, and understanding that they don't have the same, as I would guess anyway, the same sort of support network as you would do here or in Europe, obviously, if you were to get into trouble. So it's a really raw, or it looks to me anyway, a really raw sort of long distance hike, and presumably going through some very rural, remote areas, as well as obviously the flesh spots. And the map once again is very good, the way that it lays out the where are we? Let's just go to that. It lays out all the stopping points you could get to, bed and breakfasts, guest houses and campsites, as well as presumably allowing you to wild camp as you go.
Yeah. It's incredibly rural and remote in some places. The language was a huge challenge as well. I actually, in Lyon, which has quite a big Armenian diaspora, I actually spent a couple of months doing Armenian conversation classes in preparation for going. Because I'm not used to going somewhere where I don't speak the language at all, being a languages graduate, and I was quite apprehensive about going all alone and being completely unable to communicate. So I had a very, very patient Armenian teacher who kind of equipped me with the basics, and also equipped me just with a lot of vocabulary. A lot of it was, sort of food and things like that. So I was not really able to hold a conversation in Armenian, but I could make some of the basics understood by throwing out sort of the odd word that she taught me. But in terms of the route, there were large periods of time, often days on end, where you don't pass any civilization at all. The first 3 days of the hike, I didn't see a single human, not a villager, not a beekeeper, nobody. And that was incredibly strange, because I realized that hasn't happened to me before, to sort of go 3 days without seeing another human face entirely.
Yeah, I mean, I've done 24 hours and that felt strange. So several days must take some getting used to. Okay, so let's just backtrack slightly. You were sitting in your shared office in Lyon. How did you actually hear about this in the first place? And is the same offer to people available to hikers now?
So I saw a tweet. I use Twitter quite a lot to find work, because editors will often put what they're looking for on their Twitter page. And I saw a tweet about a brand new long distance trail, and that they were looking for experienced hikers to test it out. And they had an application form where you fill in a few details about yourself, and they would contact you if they were interested and if they thought you sort of matched the profile. To be honest, I didn't expect them to get back in touch with me. First of all, because I didn't have 3 months to spare to try and take on the entire Armenia, Georgia leg, because I'm at the age where all of my friends are getting married, so your summer's kind of dictated by planning it around various wedding dates. And also, I mean, maybe this is a little bit of imposter syndrome because I have done a lot of long distance hiking in different places in the world, but I also assumed that, there would be people who are vastly more experienced than me. I don't know, Leveson Wood, Bear Grylls-esque, who would be sort of applying, and that my application would be of interest. So I saw it and my interest was piqued, and I love a challenge, and I just quickly filled out the application, signed up, and I think I was actually quite late in seeing this application. And when I was on my first video call, there were people that had signed up for it sort of a year or so before. They'd known about it a long time before. But between filling out the application and being accepted and being in my first training session, it was about 24 hours in total. So I kind of filled out this application a bit on a whim, sort of thinking, oh, well, they probably won't select me anyway, and I've only got just over a month to give. Time-wise, and Megan, one of the organisers, got back to me pretty much within a few hours and was just like, yes, we'd love to have you on board. And then, by the next day I was in my first training session. It was all incredibly exciting. They were talking about it so animatedly. They were showing photos. I think I got off the first training session and cried because I was so excited. My housemate was like, get a grip. You're going off on your own for a month now, so you better stop crying about it. But it was excited tears.
Well, I have to say, I mean, just looking at this since I've heard about it the last few days, seeing your name, I've got excited for you. I think this is absolutely fantastic. I'd love to have done it, but there you go, one of those things. So just briefly then, how many people sort of were accepted for this particular first year?
So from talking to one of the organisers, a man named Tom Allen, he said that I think it was just shy of 100 people attempted at least a section of it this year. Because the route at the moment is 1,500 kilometres, and the hiking season runs from, late May, early June through to sort of at the end of September. That means that you're quite likely not to cross anybody. I bumped into 3 other people who were attempting part of the Transcaucasian Trail. I bumped into all 3 of them on one day, and they were all going the opposite direction to me. So a lot of the time, it definitely felt as though you were the only person tackling the trail.
And how did you feel then? What was the time scale between you actually applying and leaving?
I applied in, I think it was February, and I flew to Armenia end of July. I started hiking early August, so okay. I did have time to prepare to take my Armenian classes, attend the virtual training sessions.
But if you're anything like me, you probably went mad on Google trying to find as much out as possible about the countries and the characteristics of the people and also details of how to get there and get away, I guess.
Yeah. So, obsessively sort of reading any guidebooks that I could. There's not a lot on Armenia, but actually one of the few very comprehensive guidebooks that has been written about Armenia has been written by one of the trail planners, Tom Allen. So that's good because it already has quite a focus on hiking. In terms of physical maps of Armenia, because I usually like to have a physical map, not just rely on technology, pretty much non-existent. It's not possible to get a physical, comprehensive hiking map of Armenia. So I found that quite unsettling.
And so obviously you set off, you got on the plane. How did you feel when you arrived? What I mean, compared to your other experiences, obviously in South America and so on, there's a different sort of feeling, I'm sure, of anticipation.
Yeah, and I mean, I was definitely quite apprehensive. I knew that it was going to be tough. I think that I was probably less worried about the physical challenges of the trail, and I was more worried about sort of the mental challenges and the other challenges that hiking a brand new trail poses. I don't think I really had prepared myself for how tough I would find certain aspects of it. I think, you can think, okay, well, of course it's going to be tough. People haven't really done this trail before. I'm going to be on my own for a huge amount of time. There's going to be, I'm going to have to sort of do a lot of off-trail navigation. There's going to be bushwhacking. There's going to be, the language barrier and wildlife and dangerous plants that I haven't encountered before. But you can think that, and then actually putting it into practice, it really does push you. So it was very, very tough at times.
I'm just trying to find where you started from, Megri, and see if we can just put the little Google man down to see what the village or town is like, and seeing if oh yeah, he's coming in now. So let's have a look at this. So this is where he's landed, in the middle of town.
Yeah,
it looks almost French, actually.
Well. It doesn't look at all French when you're there. So Megri, it's right on it's essentially the last town before you cross over into Iran. And it's incredibly arid there. And that's the main square that marks the starting points for northbound hikers hiking the TCT. But no, it didn't look at all French when I was there, I have to say.
Did you have any difficulties literally getting from the airport to your accommodation the first night, and sorting yourself out and sort of getting yourself ready mentally and sort of tuning in, as I like to say, into the country?
Yes. Yeah. And I think maybe this is kind of the apprehension that kind of comes in traveling a little bit post-COVID as well, because I've always traveled so widely, and I have been to places where I've had a complete language barrier before, although not to go off into the wilds and, hike a trail for several weeks all on my own where I've had such a language barrier. But it had been quite a long time where, since I'd been somewhere out of Europe, and Armenia was very, very different for me. I spent a few days in Yerevan at the start. I was working on an article there, and I also needed to do things like buy camping gas. I sent on resupply packages. So one thing that's really, really good on the TCT, they've organized places that you can send resupply packages to, which is very helpful. So I spent sort of a couple of days getting my bearings and doing that. And then actually getting to the trail start in Megri was quite challenging, because it's tiny little local buses that you take. You can only book onto them by calling the bus company, which with my very rudimentary level of Armenian was just going to get me nowhere. So I found somebody to help me with that. And the bus itself takes 9 hours. And it's a very rickety little bus. Part of the roof actually fell off on the way down to Megri. So I was actually pretty happy to get off the bus and, to get walking. But that journey down to Megri took an entire day. So I didn't set off hiking until the day after the journey.
Okay. So that looks like then it was... you definitely knew you were on an adventure. When the bus comes off, the roof comes off a bus. I remember getting onto a bus a long time ago that had bullet holes in the side of it. I knew I was on an adventure.
Yeah. Where was that?
Anyway, that was in darkest Thailand, out in the mountains. Anyway, let's actually get into some pictures that you've taken. What I think I'll probably do is I'll just randomly run through some pictures as you explain what it was like, the sort of getting your feet wet, as it were, as you first started hiking, getting used to the terrain perhaps, but also the local farmers, how it was with wild camping, if you were on your own for 3 days, how that managed, how you felt. Did you feel nervous by doing it? Did you feel, obviously I'm going to ask you a safety question at some stage, but I don't want to harbour on it too much, but more really about sort of how comfortable you felt, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'd like to talk about how comfortable I felt and the safety aspect of it as well, because I think that it's important as a woman hiking alone, that it is something that I talk quite openly and honestly about as well. But to start off with, sort of how I found the trail and first impressions and how I felt. I think it took me longer than usual on this trail to to really start feeling comfortable and to feel as though I was in my rhythm. The first few days of the trail were some of the toughest days of hiking that I have ever done in my life, because the temperatures were incredibly high. And in our training sessions, we'd been warned that you could quite possibly go for 3 days without finding a water source. And when the temperatures are sort of mid-30s to pushing 40 degrees, even if you get up and you walk at, sort of strange times of night, which, I was getting up very early to hike when I was in this first part of the trail, which is a national park called Armenia National Park. You drink a lot, you get through a lot of water. So on the first day of the trail, I set off with 11 litres of water strapped to my back. And I'm 5'2". My backpack was so heavy that I was having to sort of do this kind of maneuver where I swung it onto my back. And I was going very steeply uphill, and it was exhausting. I think I racked up on the first days, but it was, my watch told me I'd done something like 800 intensity minutes. So I was absolutely beat by the end of the first day. And I didn't need all 11 litres of water, but I did get through 7 litres of water before I found a water source. So, I hadn't overgated as much as all that, really. It was incredibly arid for a lot of the hike. I think that was my first impression, going in August as well, which is, very, very dry. That photo there, that's Armenia National Park right at the beginning. And it is this kind of very toothy, arid mountains. And when you get up high, that's all you can see. You can't see any form of civilization. You can just see very craggy, toothy, dry mountains in all directions. And I'm a small person anyway, but I felt really incredibly small and isolated. I think what really helped me for the first few days of the trek, when I left Megri, I was followed by 4 street dogs. I think they were a family. There were 2 small ones and 2 that kind of looked like parents. And to start off with, I didn't really want to be followed by these very scruffy looking dogs that were sniffing at my pack the whole time. But they actually stayed with me for 4 days until I was back in sort of semi-civilization, and they got chased off by a sheepdog. And I was really glad to have them with me. And, I was having sort of full conversations with these dogs. They would sleep outside my tent. So when I woke up in the morning, completely in the middle of nowhere, I'd hear, kind of a dog sort of scratching its leg. And, I'd wake up and I'd have a little chat to the dogs that camped outside. They did steal my cheese at one point, which is one point where we did fall out a little bit. But other than that, I was really happy to have them with me. And I think, in terms of kind of what I usually find on a long distance hike is that you get huge kind of ecstatic highs. And that's what I really love about long distance hiking and going out into the wild on your own is, you get this real buzz, and you get these moments where you think, well, this is absolutely wonderful. This is fantastic. I'm on top of the world. It took longer for those highs to come. And I think that was purely because my brain was in overdrive with, having to bushwhack, having to navigate, sheer physical exhaustion. So they didn't come straight away, but when they came, they were epic.
Well, strangely, I was looking through the website, obviously the TCT website, and actually one of the warnings it was saying is beware of wild dogs. So I'm glad you made friends with them, because that looked to me as you've got to be careful. There are a few places I know around the world where the wild dogs will hunt you.
Yeah, and the sheepdogs are definitely one of the big kind of dangers of the TCT, because they will come towards you barking wildly. Everyone has a different kind of strategy of how to cope with them. There was one woman that I spoke to who said that she sort of windmilled her walking poles like this to keep them away from her. I would sort of shout "nesty," which is sit, and hope that helped. And make a lot of noise so that the shepherds would come. Somebody even suggested sitting down to let them kind of surround you, because there's often several at once. I was not going to sit on the ground and put my face at eye level with these, huge snapping dogs personally. Like, that didn't sound sensible to me. But I think that a lot of the time the bark is worse than their bite, and the shepherds are usually pretty good at coming quite quickly to help you out as well. But actually, my wild dogs that were following me, they were a good deterrent, because the big sheepdogs were more interested in my new pets than in me.
Okay. So I have to ask then, obviously, usually it's always when it's the first time. Here you are several days into your hike. What was it like when you came across your first shepherd or rural person, and how did the interaction go? Were they completely surprised to see a lone female doing this hike, or was it like, oh yeah, we've had lots of people do this over time, and they were more casual about it?
Oh no, everyone was very, very surprised to see me. It's like watching a dog walk on its hind legs, I think, seeing me trotting through these remote places on my own. The first person that I came across, to be honest, I think the first person that I came across wasn't particularly interested in me at all. It was a beekeeper in the middle of nowhere, and I was sort of staring at them, kind of blinking like, wow, that's a human face. I haven't seen one of those for 3 days. And I think they just sort of wanted to get on with whatever they were doing. But largely going through villages, I mean, people were surprised to see me on my own, and that surprise kind of manifested itself in very different ways. And sometimes it manifests itself in, this real like heartwarming hospitality, where I would be invited to stay, I'd be brought in for dinner, for coffee. I'd leave with, the contents of an entire fruit orchard bursting out of my backpack, and think, well, how can I carry all of this? But it could also manifest itself in some situations that left me feeling quite uncomfortable or unsafe as well, because a woman traveling alone, I think, anywhere in the world is vulnerable, but in Armenia, it's a very, very uncommon sight. And, it could lead people to try to push their luck as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to a few solo female travellers over the years, and it seems to fall into several categories. There's the white knight syndrome, where somebody gets overprotective and over concerned for you, and that in itself can cross over into being creepy. Then you obviously have the negative side, the people that are sort of looking for no good, as it were. But they generally, my experience and people I've spoken to, tend to be on the smaller percentage, certainly. And it's more a case of people being over-hospitable. But did you find, I mean, they're quite a conservative country, aren't they? I mean, I don't know, what's the religion? Is the religion Catholic there? Or is it Russian
It's
Orthodox?
a Christian country. It's it's the oldest Christian country in the world, I believe, which is why you see all sort of the monasteries dotted around. I want to say it's kind of Orthodox branch of Christianity, but I'm not entirely sure. I just know that it's Christian.
So, but I mean, generally their attitude to women is quite conservative. A woman's place is in the home type of thing.
Yeah, definitely. And the white knight syndrome that you spoke about, that was definitely a factor. And I remember one occasion where, a very well-meaning man tried to pretty much forcibly rip my backpack off my back. And he was like, "You can't carry that. The next town is 10 kilometers away." And I was like, "No, I assure you, I really can. I've done about 500 of these by now." And he was sort of staggering under the weight of my backpack, because obviously, he hadn't spent weeks doing that. So, I mean, that was sort of a minor annoyance. I think, on the flip side, as a woman, you do get to access places that a man walking alone wouldn't necessarily. So when I was invited in by families to stay at their home, to, have a meal with them, although I had to sort of, go through all kind of the rigmarole of, oh no, you can't walk that way, you can't go alone, you'll be in so much danger, you'll get eaten by a bear. I had to sort of go through all of that, but it did also allow me to access places that a lone man wouldn't be able to access. But that being said, I don't want to gloss over the safety aspect of it either, because I did have some experiences with men where I felt incredibly unsafe. And I remember reading the Cheryl Strayed's book, Wild, where she talks about, all the kind of the wild animals that she's encountered walking the PCT, and how actually the time she feels most threatened is when she encounters, I believe it's 2 men in the wild. And for me, certainly the time that I felt most threatened was when I accepted a kind offer, what I thought was a kind offer from somebody who had a bee farm in the middle of nowhere, who said, look, there's a lot of bears in this area, which was true. I'd seen a lot of bear prints and bear poo. You can camp at my farm. There's fences and everything, and that way you'll be safer. But he did try to force himself on me, and fortunately he was quite sort of a small, slight, skinny person, and like physically, I wasn't kind of overpowered. But that happened in the wild, and it's an incredibly uncomfortable situation, and you realise that you're incredibly remote. And after that, I took my chances with the bears, and I was very glad I did. But yeah, I mean, there's the two sides of the coin, being a woman on your own in the wild.
Yeah. Were there many women in the sort of group, or the number of people, the 100 people that actually did the trek? Were there many other women that you spoke to that were travelling solo?
There were a couple. There weren't many of us. So I would say the gender balance of people taking on the trail was probably fairly even, actually. But a lot of the women who were hiking were either doing it in a pair or, with a couple of friends. I think I spoke to 2 other women, one who hiked completely solo, who actually lives in Cornwall, incidentally, and another one who had been hiking with a friend and ended up doing a sort of 2-week stretch on her own. But women hiking on their own, were a minority, definitely.
Okay. And not that I sort of adore technology, but sometimes useful as a backup. Did you have, because it was sort of semi-organised through the people on the TCT, sort of a text ability to just say, I'm here, I'm safe every now and again? Was that part of the sort of backup or the support that they offered?
No, not really. We were all in a kind of a Slack channel group chat. So people were really, really good at, sharing what they thought about different sections of the routes. We stayed in touch via that as well and shared stories. I think I was particularly active on that because I was all alone. So when I had some kind of connection, I was probably quite annoying on the Slack chat. The organisers were definitely very up to speed with who was hiking and roughly where people were. So if you'd suddenly, dropped off the radar for a week or so, I'm sure that they would have noticed. But there wasn't really a kind of, text and check-in, because they did expect us to be very self-sufficient as well. I did take a tracker as well. I took like a Garmin GPS tracker. And I'm really glad I did. I think, it was my mother who very much wanted me to take this tracker. I was actually very, very happy that I had it when I...
So did you use the tracker, not from a safety point of view, but did you just use the tracker for here I am, I'm safe type of thing? Because you can send brief messages with it, can't you?
You can, and I was very strict with my mum that I would not be sending messages all the time, but occasionally I did send her a little message, and she had a very fun summer watching my little blue tick move across the map of Armenia, but I was happy to have it, actually. It made me feel safer.
And going back to your experience there with the beekeeper, I know obviously it can, depending on the time of day and how dark it is, did you sort of pack up and leave and extract yourself straight away, or how did it sort of finish or close?
I didn't, because it was already after dark, and I was in sort of the middle of nowhere, and I suppose the thing usually being a woman is that sadly you can be quite easily physically overpowered, but actually, especially at my height, that's definitely a factor. But actually, in Armenia, a lot of the men are very small and very slight, and this man was actually only about my height and significantly skinnier than me. And in the end, kind of took no for an answer. I didn't sleep a lot that night. I did sleep with my penknife under my pillow, and I packed up and left very early the next day.
Yeah. I mean, for the Americans listening to this, there will no doubt be people asking, "What did you take a weapon?" But you've just answered that question with a penknife, as much as it would have been if you needed it, obviously.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
well,
it wasn't there as a weapon. It was them, it's more for sort of, you always have a penknife on you when you hike. Mostly I use it
yeah,
for
it was,
slicing
yeah,
cheese, but
exactly. Cheese and apple.
exactly.
Then the other thing that immediately comes to mind is obviously, I mean, I have this vision that it is a very, very remote place. I wouldn't necessarily want to be say it was a poor country, but I should imagine it's not as affluent as France or as the UK. So how did you manage with the financial side of things? Because I assume that you would carry a fair amount of small currency with you. Did people sort of refuse to take any money, or were there cash points at the various towns that you went through that you're able to access cash? How did it sort of work from a practical point of view?
It's definitely a cash society. You definitely don't go around, with your little contactless card beeping it everywhere that you go. It's a relatively cheap country to get around as a Westerner. And all of the major towns do have cash points as well. So I set off with quite a large amount of cash because I assumed that I wasn't going to be passing, some cash points as I went around. A lot of people refused to take anything as well. And, I've touched on sort of the dodgy experience I had. So I'd really like to reiterate a lot of the really great experiences that I had as well. I mean, sort of the heartwarming experiences of families who had very little inviting me in and, insisting on feeding me and really preparing these huge banquet-like tables of food. And I mean, usually I don't eat meat when I'm in France. I'm usually a pescatarian, but in Armenia, I kind of felt as though it would be rude not to eat what people were serving up because people would have gone and shot a pheasant and they had prepared it for me, or they'd have roasted a whole chicken or something like that. And they really didn't want to take anything from you. People were so hospitable, and some days, I mean, it can be very remote, but there's also parts where you go through a lot of villages in quick succession. And on those occasions, it almost became a bit like a food and coffee marathon, because every village you pass through, people would want to welcome you in, they want to feed you. And, you'd honestly, you get to the point where you're like, well, I really can't eat anything else. I'm going to be rolling down the mountain soon.
I was going to ask about from their point of view, what did they want to know about you? What were they interested in?
If I was completely crazy, I think was a lot of it.
Married, I suppose the second question.
Married would be yes. Would be a lot of it. So frequently, depending on who was asking, frequently I suddenly became married, and then they want to know, why my husband wasn't out there protecting me, walking with me. No, the question I got a lot was menak, which means are you all alone? And then why? What are you doing? Why are you doing this? But a lot of the time, they just they want to know what you thought of Armenia, what you thought of the people, what you thought of their food as well, which I have to say is incredibly good. I didn't know a lot about Armenian cuisine before I went out there, but it's really good. A lot of it's kind of in excess, which is perfect for a hungry hiker. There's a lot of fresh vegetables. So I suppose those are the sort of questions that I got.
I remember speaking to Jenny Tuff, who did some epic adventures as a solo woman as well, and she would often say that the female of the family or the group or her she met rurally would be very, very protective and take her under the wing, and even though she was like you trying to get on, and generally they were very supportive, and she gave the impression that when she left them, they were all thinking, well, I would like a little bit of freedom. I'd like to be able to do something like this. Did you have any sort of experiences or any sort of body language that indicated that the women or the younger women or the children even thought what an exciting thing you were doing, or was it just completely out of their scope?
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of bewilderment about it rather than that's something that I would really like to do. I think a question that I got a lot from the women was, are you scared? or are you ever scared doing this? And I was like, well, yeah, sometimes, sometimes it can be quite scary. But I think a lot of it was kind of sheer confusion. And a lot of people said to me, they were like, hey, don't worry, we can drive you to the next town. It'll be much quicker, just get in the car. And I was like, no, this isn't, the idea. But I think that hiking is not big in the culture in Armenia, which is crazy because, they've got these epic landscapes that are, an absolute hiker's paradise. But hiking, whether as a woman solo or, anyone, it's not in the culture, so they just think, well, why wouldn't you get in the car and go there? You'll get there a lot faster.
Yes, but what on earth are you walking
It's true.
Absolutely. The other thing is obviously any sort of long distance hike, like we're obviously referring to American PCTs, you have these flesh pots that you go through, like say towns and cities or villages or whatever else, and pick up from supplies. You obviously had help from the TCT people about where to send parcels to. But what about practical things like camping equipment? If some of your equipment broke or you wanted to replace something or top up with gas, did you find replenishment fairly easy from that point of view?
So I did have some mishaps in my gear as well. So I'm glad you asked this question. I mean, in terms of topping up with gas, that was one thing that I vastly overcased on because I think probably I got fed a lot more regularly than I thought on the trail. So I packed far too much camping gas and I sent far too much in resupply packages and ended up sort of leaving it wherever I could. In terms of sort of broken gear, I snapped a tent pole literally on night one, which was not ideal. It was probably some of the harshest winds that I had the entire time, and I managed to mend it with the help of the repair kit that I had. And a farmer who had a huge amount of tools, so we managed to use the repair kit to fix it. But I did have about a week where my tent pole was just splintered and I was really dreading, what if I hit a really big storm. I also had a punctured sleeping mat, which I think I punctured around the seal, and to be fair, it was a very cheap sleeping mat I've had for about 5 years, so it had very, very good innings. And it was such a sort of slow, small puncture that it just meant for the second half of the trail I was waking up every hour or two and kind of re-inflating my sleeping mat, because there's not a lot of hiking and camping gear shops in Armenia. The only ones there are in Yerevan, and I could not find this puncture in the mat. It must have been so small all around the seal. So, I tried sort of immersing it in water and everything. I couldn't find the puncture. So, yeah, I just I just woke up every couple of hours and re-inflated it, and then woke up on the ground again a few hours later. So it wasn't ideal, but it worked.
Okay. So in other words, anybody undertaking this route need to think about the durability of some of their equipment. It may not necessarily have to be the lightest, but we'll come on and talk about equipment in a second. We've obviously talked about some of the negative sides and the security, but let's just be positive for a minute and tell me a handful of your absolute best moments that you'll remember forever.
There were many of them as well. So I probably should have led in with some of these positive moments. I mean, the very best part of the trail for me was the Gegem Mountains, which was described as the remotest part of the trail because you go through about 100 kilometers where you don't pass any villages. So you have to be kind of entirely self-sufficient. But what you've actually got up there in hiking season is a lot of nomad camps. So you can see them sort of dotted around the landscape. You see these sort of nomadic yurts, and it's just a crazy insight into a complete other way of life. And people invite you into their yurts to look around. And in terms of landscape as well, it's incredible because it kind of plateaus. So you climb and climb and climb to get up to the Gegems, which is largely above 3,000 meters of altitude, very, very exposed. And then it kind of flattens out. So you've got, these sort of old volcanic craters and mountains, but actually where you're walking once you're up there, it's very, very flat. So you can see for miles and miles in every direction. And it's just mind blowing, because there's all of this untouched landscape. And, other than the nomadic camps, there's no one around, there's no trail, but this part's easy to navigate because you can see sort of exactly the direction that you're going in. And, you've got this like wide open feeling of space, but it's not oppressive at all. It's kind of the sort of space that makes you want to, kind of fling your arms around and run around it all. And it's beautiful. It's really, really beautiful. And other than that, I mean, there's a lot of variety as well. I mean, it is incredibly arid, but there was some crazy scenery in an area called thru-hikers, which was a week or so before I hit the Gegans. And that's kind of an area where it's a lot of very arid gorges, it's a lot of very remote monasteries. And the name of it, thru-hikers, actually translates to Valley of Woes because it's so dry and arid. But it's wild as well. I mean, I've never been to sort of the canyons in Utah and places like that, but I imagine it would look a little bit like that because you've got all these crazy colors in the rock. It's it's kind of fiery looking. It's very inhospitable looking, but very dramatic and very beautiful.
So would you return? Would you return to the sections that you sort of missed? Because you did a couple of long sections, but you skipped a couple of bits. Was that because the trails were not open, or was it weather, or something?
It was time constraints mostly. So I wanted to hike across as much of Armenia as possible in the 4 weeks that I had to actually walk. And it's 827 kilometers. It wasn't possible to do all of that in 4 weeks, especially with the sort of terrain that I was covering. So to start off with, I kind of set off, very religiously, like, well, I will just start from the southernmost point and I will see how far I get in the 4 weeks. But then actually there are sections where, you join a bit of road. There was one day where I was on kind of a tarmacked road for most of the day. You're getting sort of inspiration from people who've done other sections and you think, God, that bit looks really gorgeous. And I thought, well, why am I, sort of doing this so religiously that I have to start from the southernmost point and just see where I finish in 4 weeks at the risk of actually skipping some of the better sections as well. So I walked from Megri to a place called Noravank. I then hitched from Noravank to a place called Shatin. Walked from Shatin to a place called Sevan, which is on the massive lake shore in Armenia, and that took me through the Gegans. And then I hitched to Dilijan, and I did a final stretch from Dilijan to a place called Tamanyan, which was just a 3-day stretch at the end, which was a beautiful, beautiful stretch as well. And if people are traveling around Armenia and they're just looking for a couple of days of hiking, I'd really recommend that stretch between Dilijan and Tamanyan because it's still fairly physically challenging, but you pass some epic monasteries, you've got crazy limestone cliffs, you pass little villages where people were probably the most hospitable of the whole trail there, and it was insanely beautiful around there.
So a couple of quick questions then before we actually get on to specifics about any equipment for the gearheads that would like to know exactly what you took. How easy is it to get there and get back, flights? And also, what sort of money did you get through as part and parcel of doing the trip?
So flights don't go direct from the UK. I flew with Pegasus Airlines, and they go via Turkey, Istanbul usually. And they've got flights going several times a week. So they're pretty easy and convenient to get in and out. And they're very reasonably priced airline as well, usually. From Lyon, there's actually direct flights going, but I had weddings in the UK, either side of the track. So I hence going sort of in and out of London. In terms of sort of money that I got through, it wasn't expensive. And, when I passed a guest house, I often stayed in the guest house because it was very hot for a lot of the trip. It was very, very dusty. And I was very happy to spend extra to have a shower or, to have a proper meal rather than, kind of instant dehydrated meals when I could. But I mean, in terms of the whole thing, I think, even with a little bit of time either side, I'm really not stinting myself. I think in Armenia, I wouldn't have spent more than £1,000 the whole trip, and that was with having a few days in the Yerevan at the start, having a few days at a really nice campsite with a pool at the end. I mean, generally, if you come across a guest house in Armenia, in somewhere fairly remote in the middle of nowhere, it's going to cost you in the region of about £10 with a meal. So yeah, it's really not much at all.
Okay. And for anybody looking at this now seriously in the UK, the exchange rate as we speak at the moment seems to be 2 to 1. So if it says 10, what's the actual currency?
Oh God, I've forgotten. That's terrible, isn't it? I was using it for a month and I can't even remember what the Armenian currency is. I've still got some in my purse as well.
Well, anyway, it's two to 1. That. So if you see 10 units, it's actually £5 roughly, to give you an idea. Seems to be the exchange rate. Okay, so for the gearheads, myself included, just a quick rough down idea of what you took. It sounds like you travelled fairly lightweight anyway, and obviously we always like to know the best piece of equipment and the worst piece of equipment. Not necessarily because it failed, but just actually it was useless.
Yeah, sure. So I try to travel fairly light, and I do have quite a lot of lightweight gear. But I'm definitely not kind of one of these like ultra light fans who sacrifices comfort to just reduce the weight of my pack by a few grams. I know that some people will cold soak all of their meals and things like that. I definitely didn't do that. And I think also when you're spending that amount of time on your own, there probably are a few comforts that you want. Like I took a little lightweight coffee press so that I could have proper coffee when I was hiking around for a month on my own. And I'm glad I did. It was luxury that I really appreciated. In terms of sort of the best kind of most helpful gear that I took, I'm going to make you uncomfortable here, but as a woman, I think that one of the very best pieces of gear that you can take is a menstrual cup for through hiking. It's absolutely invaluable. Dramatically reduces the amount of waste that you have to carry as well. I had some really good clothing on this trip, like real good kind of moisture wicking clothing. I was gear testing a few things, and one that really stood out, I had this top from a little brand called Iron Roots, which is a small kind of ethical brand that make their clothing using eucalyptus. And it was fantastic for moisture wicking. It was fantastic for temperature regulation as well. And I wore this top day after day, and I don't think I smelled too bad. I mean, I didn't really cross many people who could have told me otherwise, but really I think it stayed pretty fresh for the amount of time that I was wearing it and the amount that I was sweating into it. And in terms of the worst gear, my battery packs were terrible, and I would invest in a solar power battery pack next time, because I had cheap little battery packs and I was using the GPS a lot, because there's no physical maps of the route, and most of the route is completely unmarked. It wasn't obvious where you were going at all, so you were quite heavily reliant on an app with GPS, which drains your battery a lot. So I was using my phone a lot more than I would usually use it on a through hike, and the cheap battery packs that I had were rubbish. And if I was going to do it again, I would take a good solar charging battery pack.
Okay, so just to narrow that down then, on the battery pack front, for somebody doing something like this, were you charging a GPS? I mean, by the GPS, do you mean your phone or the Garmin system?
My phone. I mean, the Garmin holds battery life for a really long time, so that was fine. But I think any smartphone, I wouldn't say that my smartphone battery life is particularly poor. But if you're using the GPS on it all day, like the battery goes down pretty quickly.
Okay. So were you able to charge your battery pack when you got to the guest houses or whatever? It was not necessarily a problem. I'm just thinking about the amount of equipment we all take, that's all.
Yeah, so at guest houses, I could always charge my battery pack, or if I went to a campsite. The last 3 days of the trail, I actually, I thought that I would go really, really ultralight for the last 3 days and I left quite a few things, including my coffee press, at the hostel in Dilijan. And I forgot my battery pack, and, you know, set off on day one, you know, happy as anything. Camped that night, and then realised that I'd forgotten my battery pack, and that, you know, my phone was not going to make it through 3 days. And I ended up charging my phone. I came up to a farmhouse belonging to a pig farmer called Saka, who's one of my favourite people I met all trail. And he very kindly charged my phone up for me, which kind of shored it up for these sort of last couple of days, you know, rationing it of the trek. He also fed me an absolutely enormous meal, fed me what I thought was apple juice, tasted like it, turned out to be homemade brandy. So I kind of was rather woozy, kind of winding my way along the trail after that. And then the nicest thing was that on the following day, so I met him on day 2 of the final 3-day leg, I was walking through a little village, and I suddenly heard somebody call out my name. And it was Saka, the pig farmer, who was in this village visiting his brother who lived there. And he saw me coming through, and he was like, Anna, and started saying Nahajash, which is breakfast. And he was like, come on in. And, you know, invited me into his brother's home for breakfast. And suddenly the whole spread came out. He was like, give me your phone, I'll charge it up again. Fed me huge quantities, tried to feed me vodka for breakfast as well, which I declined. And waved him on my way. And it was a lovely, lovely way to start what I knew was my final day of walking, you know, with kind of this whole entourage coming out of the village and all of Saka's family waving me off, with far too much food, more than I needed for the final day.
So all that apprehension you had right at the very beginning, just have a nice ending like that. You're well truly tuned in to the people and the country.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think you've been a fantastic guest, Anna. Thank you so much for being so entertaining and also so informative about something that's so fresh and exciting. I got very excited looking at it. I'm sure a lot of people will be following this link to and feeling exactly the same and thinking about the options. So it's definitely a proper trek, a proper hike, and definitely has the remoteness to it. Now, I do like to have a final question, and it's always a good one to see how people react. So of all the things I could have asked you about this particular adventure that you've had, what should I have asked you?
That's tricky, because I think you've asked a lot of really good questions, because, you know, we've spoken about the landscape, and I've been able to sort of describe, you know, the most gorgeous parts of the hike, and I'm really glad that you touched on, you know, the safety aspects as well, and kind of, you know, how I felt hiking, because, you know, mentally it was very challenging. I don't know. I maybe say, you know, if people are planning to do this hike before, if they're planning to do this hike, in the future, like who is it for and what to be aware of? And I think I would just be aware that just reiterate that the hike really is in its infancy, and that comes with some immense rewards as well. You know, you go on a hiking trail, like, for example, the GR20 or the Annapurna circuit, you know, sort of thinking about sort of other long distance hikes that I've done, which are spectacular, and the scenery is absolutely amazing, but you don't get that feeling of solitude. And on the Transcaucasian Trail, you really do get that solitude, and you kind of, you know, you get that sort of almost explorer feeling of that you feel a little bit like you're the first person seeing a place. And at times it's incredibly frustrating. I think that's the payoff for doing something that is so, you know, is so brand new. But at times it's incredibly rewarding, and you kind of, you know, you feel as though you're the first person getting to do something, even though obviously you're not. And this has taken years and years of painstaking planning from the people organising the TCT. But, you know, for the right people that have hiked a lot, you know, it's an incredibly rewarding experience.
Is there anything particularly that you feel you should have taken? There's something that you missed, just as that we haven't touched on at all, that would have been really useful?
Actually, no. I think, you know, this maybe comes from, you know, probably sort of over planning a little bit, because I took too much gas. I took too much food for most of it as well, because I didn't anticipate how much people would feed me. I think, you know, that the main thing really would have been the battery pack. And other than that, the thing that I really didn't use much in my backpack was my raincoat. But I mean, I'm glad I had it with. I had one day of rain in an entire month. I was incredibly lucky with the weather. I didn't experience like a lot of storms. I had, some high winds, but no, kind of really bad storms. So my raincoat was, kind of languishing unused in my backpack most of the time. But that being said, I wouldn't have left it out because, guaranteed if you don't take your raincoat, it would have pissed it down multiple times during the hike. So no, really.
Brilliant. Well, Anna, thank you so much indeed for your time. It's been absolutely a great pleasure to talk to you. Do you have any final thoughts or any more routes you're going to be pioneering, or are you sitting comfortably in Lyon for a quiet?
I'm definitely going to be in Lyon for the foreseeable future. I mean, sort of work commitments that I've got. I've got some long-term projects that are going to keep me quite firmly in France, I think, for the next year or so. But there's some incredible hiking in France, and the next long distance hike that I'd really like to do, which would probably seem very civilized after, not very remote at all after Armenia, is a hike called the Tour des Écrins, which is a loop in Écrins National Park, national, I think, not regional, in the Alps. So it's probably about a 2-hour drive from my house. I reckon it's probably going to be about sort of a 6-day loop or so. But I'm going to be waiting to do that when the weather gets a bit warmer. I think it'll be day hikes for the time being as we're coming into winter.
Well, fantastic. Well, I wish you the best of luck and safe travels on that. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, wasn't that a fascinating conversation? Thanks very much indeed to my guest Anna for taking the time to explain so eloquently and enthusiastically the information on the TCT. If you want the links, of course, they all can be found over on the outdoorstation.co.uk website, and you'll see there links to Anna, her work, the pictures from the event, and also a link to the video if you're listening to this on the audio. My thanks to everyone for their support and comments over the last few months in getting me back up to speed in getting these podcasts out. And please, when you do have a look at the website, do leave a comment, and any feedback you can when you see this popping up on social media. It's greatly appreciated. And of course, if you're able to, a review on iTunes would get me back up to speed and back up into the top 10 as well, which would be greatly appreciated. So I hope you enjoyed that, folks. And for podcast listeners, part 2 is coming very soon. Until next time, take care out there, and bye for now.